Okay, let's record this. Okay, welcome everyone. We're doing Learning Unit 6, Chapter 9 on intelligence, and I apologize for the spelling mistake on the front page, which isn't good. Maybe I was in a bit too much of a hurry in between marking assignments. So we're going to do this learning unit now. I know it costs more to drive than that. Yeah, for sure. Okay, so human intelligence, basically what this learning unit is going to show us, it's going to show us what intelligence is as a concept. We're going to look at the historical perspective of intelligence and intelligence testing. We'll look at theories of intelligence. We'll look at a brief overview of psychometric testing and its use in South Africa. Okay, that's what our overview is going to show us. So according to our module outline, our learning unit is still broken down into the different themes and different learning outcomes, and there's specific page references there. So I've done my PowerPoint according to the page references, so we cover exactly what's here, which is distinguishing between intelligence and IQ, looking at the history, differentiating between the single factor view of intelligence, multiple abilities, looking at fluid and crystallized intelligence, looking at how psychological tests are used, looking at psychometrics, looking at reliability and validity of tests, and looking at a brief overview of South African intelligence tests, and looking then again at the end at intellectual disability and giftedness. So let's move on with this now. Okay, so as I said before my slides went a bit pear-shaped, is that because intelligence has, this module has not formed part of an assignment or any of our ICE tasks, for sure you're going to get questions on intelligence in your final exam. So make sure you know and understand it. So we start firstly with the definition of intelligence, and I would probably assume, because I've seen it before, is a typical question would be to define intelligence in your own words. So make sure that you understand what intelligence is. So according to our textbook, when we look at intelligence, we're looking at intelligence as a broad concept. So it's a broad ability of using complex mental skills, so that's skills of our brain and our mind, the mental activities or processes to attend to tasks, to solve problems, be able to comprehend abstract ideas and information. Okay, so it's those mental activities and processes which include things like knowing things, perceiving things, remembering, problem solving, reasoning, and understanding. So it's not a narrow focus. Intelligence is a broad concept, and it's using complex mental skills and activities and processes. So there's a number of things that go on in our brains in order for us to process information, to understand information, and intelligence in its broadest sense also has to take into account cultural and social variables as well. So that's its broad definition. There is a psychometric approach, which is the scientific approach for measuring intelligence, which we call IQ, which is the intelligent quotient. So intelligence itself is very broad, but there is a specific process, a scientific process is for measuring it, and it comes down to measuring an IQ, which is where the words intelligence quotient come from. It's a testing of intelligence. So it's a numerical representation of an individual's level of intelligence as measured, standardized scientific tools of measurement. So it's done in a scientific way and in a standardized approach to measure intelligence. And those are what we call intelligence tests. So IQs are the results of your intelligence tests. So mainly IQ tests are focused on skills that are linked to academic success, things like abstract reasoning and verbal fluency. But in general, intelligence, as we said, is a much broader concept. So from a theoretical point of view, it has to take into account things like cultural relevance, social relevance, historical background, and economic frameworks of societies at any given time. So it's important that there is the one way of looking at intelligence from the scientific approach of measuring it and testing, but we also have to look at it from a theoretical approach, which is a much broader approach. And as we move through the learning unit and we look at how intelligence testing has developed and how psychological testing has developed, you'll start to see how intelligence tests have developed to include more of those broader complex skills. So when we look at what intelligence is, we have to look at the bigger picture. We have to look about how normal people in society sort of understand intelligence, and how we understand intelligence often informs research around intelligence. So when we look at intelligence from our own perspective, we see a number of different things in there. We see a verbal intelligence, about being able to speak clearly and articulate, be verbally fluent. We have a practical level of intelligence where we look at problems and can assess situations. And we also have a social intelligence. So it's really important to understand that intelligence can be perceived to be something a lot broader than just a measurement of specific verbal fluency and abstract reasoning skills. And you'll see that as we move through the module. So it's the difference between intelligence as a broad concept and intelligence as a specific measurement for testing various processes like abstract reasoning and verbal fluency. So a good perspective from which to look at this is the historical overview and how intelligence testing, which is the development of that IQ testing, was sort of developed. And it started with Sir Francis Galton, who basically said that intelligence is inherited and it moves down from generation to generation. So a clever mother will produce a clever child. It's in the genes, it's hereditary genius. But the problem with that, and being from so long ago, is, as we saw with psychology, a lot of psychology came from specific ranks of society. So the subjects for his establishment of this hereditary genius were all from upper echelons of society, upper ranks of society. So it wasn't an accurate reflection of the entire population. And he looked at intelligence being measured as a speed of response to stimuli. So it wasn't predicting any kind of academic or professional success, but what it did was it set the stage for intelligence to be measured from an objective and scientific way. So the first sort of breakthrough came, and you might have heard of Binet and his intelligence scale. So Alfred Binet was asked by the Minister of Education in France to basically develop a test that looked at children and established whether they were normal or subnormal and whether they needed to go into special education programs. So he developed the first useful test of what was a general mental ability. And his test that was developed sort of became the basis for the development of future IQ tests. And along with a colleague, they developed the Binet-Simon scale, which basically expressed a score of intelligence in terms of a mental level or a mental age. So the child did the test, they might have been age 6 chronologically, but they might have had a very different mental age according to their particular scale. And the reason that posed challenges is you couldn't compare people across different ages, okay, because it brought it down to a mental age and it wasn't really associated to a chronological age. So there was no level of comparison, but it was a good starting point. And then in 1912, which was not too much long after that, a German psychologist basically introduced the whole term of intelligence quotient, or IQ, as a measure of intelligence. So moving away from a mental age, he developed a process whereby you could compare children of different ages. So it's even like now as adults, if you take an intelligence test now and somebody takes an intelligence test at the age of 18, your intelligence score, it's not necessarily age dependent. So there's an ability to compare across ages. So his IQ formula was he took the mental age as per the score and he divided it by the chronological age and multiplied by multiplied it by 100. So he was getting the ability that we could use an IQ to compare regardless of the age of the person taking the test or the child taking the test. So that was part of the progression of development. So in 1916, Professor Lewis Terman published the Stanford Binet Intelligence Test Scale, and that used the basis of the original Binet-Simon scale, but it also included the IQ ratio. But what he did was he adjusted it to suit American children, and it was very much used in the American system to place American children into a schooling system, but it was a definite progression on the test that had already been developed, and it's formed the continual basis for IQ testing, and it's been revised a number of times with the latest revision in 2003. So it's something that is still very much in effect, the Stanford Binet Intelligence Test Scale, but it has been updated and made more standardized across different populations. And then David Veschler came along, and he developed in 1939 the Adult Intelligence Scale. So he then moved away from the verbal ability of children, and he included items that were now more comprehensive. So items that included not necessarily verbal, but also non-verbal reasoning. So he discarded that whole issue of intelligence, the IQ intelligence quotient, and he looked at a new scoring system based on a normal distribution in a population. And his way of scoring this has been now accommodated into other tests. So we'll look at that on the next page. But you can see that when you look at the Veschler Adult Intelligence Scale, it's far more comprehensive. It's got verbal IQ, non-verbal IQ, comprehension, working memory, perceptual organization, processing speed. So it's a far more comprehensive test, and it's a test that's still very much in use, and a test that has been adapted for different populations and different cultures. But what he basically did was he then said he put intelligence on a bell curve, okay, and that's a bell curve, and that's a normal distribution across a population. And we see it in many characteristics, this bell curve, and it's basically saying that within a population, this is how characteristics are dispersed. So if you look right in the middle there, okay, that's your average population. That highest point is your average. So what it says to you, if you look at the IQ score at the bottom, it says according to the population, if we look at IQ, most people fall in the middle of that. That's where the mean is for the population with an IQ score of 100. Okay, so he tested it, and he said, okay, well, now we can create this curve that now looks at the distribution of intelligence across the population. If we look to the far left of it, that is where the IQ, there's a far lower IQ. It drops from 70 to 55, and we'll see later that's where people with intellectual disabilities fall. It's a smaller portion of the population. It's quite extreme. And if you look to the right-hand side, that is where your higher IQ sits. That's where you start to move towards giftedness. And again, a much smaller portion of the population. But in the middle is the mean, and that's where the majority of people sit, is within that intelligence score of really from 85 to 115. And then it's worked out as standard deviations from the mean. So we have the bell-shaped curve, and the key point is that modern IQ scores indicate exactly where you fall in the normal distribution of intelligence. So if I do an IQ test and I get 90 for my IQ test, I know that I'm sitting within the average of the population. If I get 110, I'm still within the average of the population. But if I start to do 130, I'm moving now into a different realm and moving towards a different classification for my intelligence. And IQ tests are valid measures of the kind of intelligence that's necessary for one to do well in their academic work. But again, it's something that is controversial, because if the purpose is to assess intelligence, is actually, like we said, intelligence is a very broad concept. How valid IQ tests are can be debatable. Okay, so there are other tests that would be done or other situational factors that need to be taken into account. And we see this when we look at intellectual disability. And intellectual disability is, as per our DSM-5 classification, when we look at the classification of intellectual disability, it looks at intelligence testing, but it also looks at other things as well. So it is just a portion of that diagnosis is somebody's score on their intelligence test. So when we look at testing intelligence, the psychometric approach, which is the scientific approach like we discussed, has attempted to develop multiple reliable tests that measure individual differences in intellectual ability. So the theoretical approach, like we discussed at the beginning, that broad approach focuses on understanding the nature of intelligence as well as the sub-skills that make up this ability. So we've got that scientific approach that measures it from an IQ perspective, but the theoretical approach says we need to take the broader perspective and we need to say there's a number of skills that make up the ability of intelligence, and it's that informs the way that intelligence tests are developed and used, as well as how they are interpreted. So there are two key perspectives to this. One is that there's a single factor view, and the one is that there's a multiple factor view to intelligence. So the single factor view is that intelligence itself as a broad concept is actually a singular construct. It's a construct of intelligence. And Charles Spearman developed a statistical procedure called factor analysis. So he looked at a whole lot of different factors that could make up intelligence, a mechanical skill, a spatial skill, a verbal skill, a numerical skill. He took all of those factors, but he actually found that there were relationships between each of those, that they could be clustered together. They correlated highly with each other. I think we had this when we discussed personality factors and how we came up with the 5-factor model, is there were all of those factors of personality, but clustered together, there were a lot of factors that correlated together. They showed a strong relationship. So what he did is he said all of these factors actually correlate together highly. They're all very much related to each other. Then he said there's one single factor that underlies them all. And he said all of those factors share a common core factor, which is G. He called it G, and G was our general mental ability. So all of our better known tests are influenced by this. Okay, so the one factor G, the mental ability, is actually made up of a number of factors that actually all correlate highly together. And so he came up with the G factor. So following from that, Lewis Thurston looked at the multiple factor, and he said that multiple factors need to be, intelligence is made up of multiple factors, and it can't just be attributed to one thing. So he had 7 primary mental abilities that he identified that he said were now multiple factors. So we had Spearman with his G, and then we had Lewis Thurston with his multiple factors. But when they took the multiple factors, they showed again that those factors were correlated together, which still supported the fact that intelligence can be related to a single factor, which is the G factor. So that his theory of multiple factor was quite limited because his factors actually also did correlate together. Oh, please don't do this again. Oh, there we go. All right, so we've got the G factor, which is numerous abilities all correlated to one specific point, the G factor. Now we speak about fluid and crystallized intelligence. And I know there was a question in a previous exam paper about explaining the difference between fluid and crystallized intelligence. So this is quite a recent theory. This was in the 1980s. And Cattell, who was a psychologist, he took G, which Spearman had developed as intelligence, being made up of multiple factors, all correlated highly together. And he divided G into 2 different things, 2 parts. And if we think about our intelligence, our own intelligence, we can see this. This makes sense to us. He said there's a fluid intelligence, which involves reasoning ability, memory capacity, and speed of information processing. And then he said there's a crystallized intelligence, which involves the ability to apply what we know, our knowledge and skills, to solving problems. So that I put a table there which can help show the difference as well as a graph. So a fluid intelligence, that ability for reasoning and memory capacity and speed of information processing, that seems to be very much based in nature. It's an inherited ability to reason and think. It's got a very much a neurophysiological base. It depends on the state of our brain and our nervous system. It's got a minimal dependence on school learning or acculturation. It's very much inductive reasoning and problem solving. Whereas our crystallized intelligence is basically an accumulation. It's a buildup of what we know. It's information acquired over a lifetime. It's an application of skills. So as we learn, we apply the skills, and then we learn some more and we apply the skills. So it's growing all the time, that body of intelligence of how to apply things. It's like learning with psychology. The more we learn, the more we apply ourselves, the more we grow in the discipline. We're building our crystallized intelligence. It's very much education dependent, so it's based on knowledge. It's very much around verbal and general knowledge. And as we know, the older we get, the better our verbal skills get and the better our general knowledge skills get. And it's very much dependent on nurture. So if we look at the graph, the blue line is our crystallized intelligence, which can basically increase across our lifespan, whereas our fluid intelligence really grows up into a point and then it starts to decrease because our brains, the neurons start to slow down. We have some kind of degeneration. We're unable to sort of learn anymore, but our ability to use what we've learned is growing, our crystallized intelligence. And so what he did with this distinction of these two different intelligences, he allowed the IQ testing to become more comprehensive in its assessment, including areas of strength and difficulty. So now what happens is intelligence is now considered as multifaceted, and aspects of intelligence are not independent of each other, but they're all linked together, which make a holistic construct. And when we use the word construct, the construct itself is intelligence, and it's now a broad concept. So we can see now how measuring intelligence right at the beginning on focusing in on people's reaction to a stimuli has now grown extensively, and it can incorporate these different theories of what intelligence is as a construct into our testing process. So let's hope this doesn't happen again. So we discussed intelligence tests, but now let's look at psychological tests. So psychological tests, like intelligence tests, are measurement instruments. An intelligence test is a type of psychological test. Okay, there are many different kinds of psychological tests. And with the evolution of psychological testing, as it's grown, as these theories have been incorporated, as we've looked at things from different perspectives, we've come up with different categories of psychological testing, each which serve different purposes. So one of the purposes we use psychological testing is in research, and we use it in research to measure and evaluate specific psychological constructs such as intelligence. Okay, so we use it in our research, and we did a personality test in our previous assignment and ICE tasks, and that is a type of psychological test, and it's used to evaluate a specific construct like intelligence, like personality, like emotion, used to evaluate that. The other purpose of psychological tests is on an individual basis, and it's to evaluate functioning in individuals in order to diagnose something and recommend interventions. So those are the two different ways that psychological tests can be used, is at a research level, for constructs and with individuals to aid in diagnosis and to recommend interventions. So there's two different kinds of psychological tests. One focuses on mental ability, and within mental ability, we've discussed intelligence testing, which is our general mental ability, which looks at our intellectual potential rather than our accumulated successes, but it can be used to predict future success. We look at aptitude. There's a type of test called aptitude tests. You've probably heard about them. You've probably done aptitude tests. They look at our potential to perform specific skills. So, for example, in a workplace, there might be an aptitude test done to see if you're suitable for a certain job. And in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see a kind of aptitude testing process that could be used in an organization to see what job you might fit into depending on your skills in that particular job. And you have an achievement test. And an achievement test is a measure for previous learning and knowledge of subjects, and it's usually age and grade appropriate. Okay, so when you write your end of year exams or whatever it is, that is a kind of achievement test. It's measuring your previous learning and knowledge of subjects. So when you write your exams at the end of the year, it's not an intelligence test, it's an achievement test. And an example of an achievement test is in South Africa, they did a test on literacy. And they did a study, and basically in 2015, they took 12,800 South African grade 4 learners to see how they could read compared to their peers around the world. They were measuring achievement based on previous learning and knowledge. And the answer to this question is, out of all of the countries in the world, South Africa came last. So that is a type of achievement test. So within mental ability tests, we have intelligence, we have aptitude, and we have achievement. The other kind of test, a psychological test that we're now very familiar with because of the work we've done in this module, is a personality test. Okay, and that measures personality traits, and I think we've seen enough of personality and personality tests to understand what that is. Yeah, Lou, that is a very you know, when you do an achievement test like that and set in motion massive early literacy programs to try and address those gaps, and that's where the recommendation of interventions comes. So the achievement test was done, the diagnosis was made that we perform very poorly, and so now recommendations of interventions have been made to actually improve the performance of early learning and reading. So those are the ways that psychological tests are used. So then we talk about psychometrics. Now, psychometrics is yeah, it is very eye-opening. It's the same situation in mathematics as well. It's both literacy and mathematics. So psychometrics, what psychometrics is a science, and it's the science of measuring the attributes of psychological tests and the procedures used to evaluate their properties. So tests are standardized. Basically, if you have a personality test or you have an IQ test or you have the adult intelligence scale, they're standardized. It's the same test. If you go to an educational or a career counselor, they might give you a specific career profiling test or some kind of test to see what occupation you might be interested in. A number of psychologists or career counselors would use exactly the same test. It's a uniform standardized test. If you go online and you look for psychological tests, you will find many, 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 many psychological tests that have been developed for many, many, many purposes. But they're standardized. It means that they've been designed correctly. The questions have been thought out, the scoring has been standardized, there's a uniform process of how they're administered, and the scoring is done through a very specific process. So psychometrics is a science, and becoming a psychometrist is one of the things you can do when you study psychology and you get an honors in psychology. You could actually become a psychometrist. So assessment instruments that have been scientifically proven to be valid and reliable allow us to quantify and measure psychological constructs such as cognitive ability, personality, aptitude, etc. And a psychometrist is a psychologist, using my words today, psychological practitioner who has a special expertise in the administration and the interpretation of its assessments. So you can't just give a test. I can't just pick a test off the internet and give it to somebody and then pick up a sort of multiple choice marking sheet and mark. There's a special way that tests have to be marked and inferences have to be made. So to become a psychometrist in South Africa, you have to have your honors, and I'm just giving you this because it shows you what else you can do with your profession. You have to still done your internship, and you get basically qualified as a psychometrist, which means that you can administer and mark and interpret psychological tests of various kinds. So that is what psychometric testing is. We then have to look at what reliability and validity of tests refers to. So if we look at psychological assessment and we look at any form of assessment, we have to know that the results that we get are reliable. Okay, so a reliable test, and we saw some people commented on this in our personality testing, as we did that personality test, and it would say, if I did this again in a week's time, would the results be the same? If I did this again in a year's time, would the results be the same? But a test to be reliable has to be the same regardless of any unpredictable circumstances. So if you take the test once and you take it a second time, you should be able to get the same results. That's what it means to say a test is reliable. And before a test can even be published or put for use, its reliability has to be tested across a population. So the tests that you get when they are official kinds of psychological tests, they've been tested for reliability. So regardless of when you take the test should give the same results. That means the results are consistent, the test is reliable. Okay, the other thing we have to look at is validity. Is that validity tells us, is the test measuring what it is supposed to measure? It satisfies the objectives. So if you're doing a personality test, you need to know that the content of that test is testing your personality. It's not testing something else, because if it was testing something else, it would not be a valid personality test. So within validity, there's different kinds of validity. The content validity says basically that what is in the test, the content of the test, is representative of the entire domain it's supposed to cover. So, example, an educational test is specifically measuring educational issues. So that's what I want to measure. I want to measure education. Is my content measuring education and not something else? Criterion-related validity basically says that it looks at your score on a test, and it looks at a test that a different test that's also testing the same thing. Okay, so it basically says it's estimated by correlating the subject's score on one test with their score on another test that's measuring the same thing. Is the criterion valid? And you have concurrent validity, which looks at your current characteristics, and it also looks at predictive validity. So it's predicting future aspects of behavior. And the construct validity is the extent to which evidence shows that a test measures a particular hypothetical construct that it was designed to measure. So if the test was developed to measure aggression, is it measuring aggression specifically, the construct of aggression? That's what construct validity is. So once a test is published for use for a specific thing, it needs to show that it's reliable, and it would have gone through multiple tests to check that it is valid, that it's actually measuring what it's supposed to measure. So a good example there, and I don't know if you've heard of national benchmark tests, which is a lot of tests now that universities put in place for their first-year students as a predictor of academic success. So, you know, you might only get into university if you scored a certain mark and higher in your national benchmark tests. So if we look at validity and content validity or criterion validity in this, if you're a researcher and you want to know if the national benchmark tests that the universities require you to take or require students to take can predict future academic performance, you basically take your national benchmark test and you say, okay, well, this was a measure of academic ability, but I'm now going to take the marks at the end of the first semester, and I'm going to look at those marks as also an accepted measure of academic performance. So now we're measuring two different tests, but they're both measuring academic performance, and then you want to compare the two together. Okay, so if you say that here's my NBT results and here are the end of the results of the first semester and the two are close, then you know the national benchmark test is actually measuring academic ability. So that's how the issue of criterion related validity works. It's being able to say, if I measure academic ability on this test, and I measure it on a different test, are the two close together? Therefore, my first test is a predictor of what I'm trying to be able to measure. Okay, I hope that is clear and understandable. So now the next part of our learning outline wanted us just to look at intelligence testing in South Africa. So obviously, you know, we spoke about populations and standardizing to populations. Therefore, it's very important that all tests are normed against the population they're assessing. So it's important to make sure that our tests take into consideration multicultural issues as well as multilingual issues in order to ensure that people are being assessed fairly and adequately. So in South Africa, there are certain tests that have been developed that have certainly taken into account multicultural issues and multilingual issues. Tests that high school learners can take, which is standardized across the norm of high school learners in South Africa between the age of 7 and 16 years, called the Senior South African Individual Scale, which measures verbal and non-verbal performance. There's one that can be used for primary school students, which has also been standardized between the age of 3 years and 7 years to assess whether they're ready for formal schooling. It's a standardized test. And there's also the South African version of that adult intelligence scale, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, that's been normed to our population. So it's taken the adult intelligence scale and it said, well, in a South African context, let's make sure that we do a test that can be used in a standardized way across South Africans. There is a very nice case study in your textbook on page 363 that speaks about a young girl, Lindiwe, who does an intelligence test at school because she's not doing so well, but it's also taking into account her circumstances in which she lives. And it just shows you how within an educational situation that when we look at doing intelligence testing or personality testing, we also have to look at other factors that's happening in somebody's life at the same time. And there's a concept called acculturation, which is also where one cultural group adopts the practices of another cultural group. That's what acculturation means. And you can have it where there isn't, even in South Africa, and we do some kind of, like the South African primary school test that children do, if you've got an urban culture and you've got a rural culture, there could be a big difference between the two cultures. So, you know, culture can be like that. It can be rural and urban, not necessarily religion or as whether you are a Zulu culture or an Afrikaans culture. There's an urban rural culture, and the test could be developed across the population, but within that population we do have cultures as well where differences in testing can arise. Right, now we move on to the section on intellectual disability and giftedness. Now, if we look at, there's that bell curve again that we spoke about when we were looking about intelligence being normed to the population. So there's our bell curve. The Wechsler Intelligence Scale is set so that about 2% of the population is above 130. So that's where your gifted and very high intelligence lies. And about 2% of the population is below 70. And that's where people with intellectual disabilities sit in terms of the intelligence scale. So where we had the bell curve, we can now see what percentage of the population sits in those different extremes of that curve. So about 2% of the population have intellectual disabilities, and about 2% of the population sit in very high and gifted intelligence abilities. Okay, so we're going to first speak about intellectual disability. Now, intellectual disability is that 2% of the population that sits down on the left-hand side of our bell curve. And what intellectual disability refers to is two things. And when we look at the diagnosis in terms of DSM-5, like I said, if someone is diagnosed with an intellectual disability, it means that they've got below average general mental ability, which originates before the age of 18 years, which is accompanied by deficiencies in adaptive skills. Okay, so psychometrically, that's using the scientific testing. Intellectual disability is associated with IQ scores below 80. So you would do an intelligence test, the actual measure of intellectual disability using an IQ test. If somebody gets below 80, it means that they fall into that intellectual disability percentage of the population. But it has to be accompanied as well by deficiencies in adaptive skills. And those adaptive skills are things like conceptual skills, social skills, as well as practical skills. So evaluating adaptive skills to everyday living is an important part of the diagnosis. So the diagnosis is not dependent only on test scores, it's dependent on those adaptive scores as well, and that is where other professionals can come in, such as an occupational therapist and psychologists, and they use different ways to measure individuals' levels of functioning in this regard. So intellectual disability is a below average IQ, along with deficits in various adaptive skills, conceptual, social, as well as practical skills. So when we look at the diagnosis of intellectual disabilities, it's divided into 4 different categories, ranging from a mild intellectual disability to a profound intellectual disability. So if we take our 2% of our population that have an intellectual disability, the majority of those people have a mild intellectual disability. And generally, those people who fall into this category can generally learn reading, writing, and math skills between the different grade levels. They can have jobs and live independently, and that's where the majority of intellectual disabilities sit. Moderate disabilities is 10% of that portion of the population. They may be able to learn some basic reading and writing, able to learn functional skills such as safety and self-help, may require some kind of oversight or supervision. A severe intellectual disability is a smaller portion still, and probably not able to read or write, although they may learn self-help skills and routines, require supervision in their daily activities and living environment. And then you get somebody with a profound intellectual disability, which is a very small proportion of the population of people who have an intellectual disability, and they might require intensive support, may be able to communicate by verbal or other means, may have other medical conditions that require ongoing nursing or therapy. So within our intellectual disabilities, there are different categories, and when you have a DSM-5, what is evaluated is your IQ as well as those other adaptive skills, and it would put you into one of those categories. And intellectual disabilities are diagnosed younger, in people younger than the age of 18. So what causes intellectual disabilities in people? The etiology, the causation, we've just discussed this. Often it is nurture, organic, as well as nature. Other way around. Nature is organic and nurture, okay, or a combination of both. So we've already discussed genetic influences when we've looked at was it child in development, was it that module? Yes, genetic influences. So that is genes, it's passed down. Down syndrome is an intellectual disability from an extra chromosome. And please excuse me because this word I struggle to pronounce. Let's say phenylketonuria. ketonuria, which is an inherited enzyme deficiency which can cause brain damage. And you also have hydrocephaly, which is where there's an accumulation of cerebrospinal fluid in the skull, which causes compression of the brain, basically in the brain ventricles. So those are genetic things that can cause intellectual disability in children. So we also have, at the same time, we have environmental influences. So we've got genetic influences and environmental influences, and it can be a combination of both. So prenatal, when the child is still in the womb, those maternal influences we spoke about, fetal alcohol syndrome, exposure to environmental toxins, stress, anything that can happen while the child is still in the womb can cause brain damage. And we saw that when we looked at those different factors in the work that we've done. You can have trauma during childbirth, called perinatal trauma. So during birth, a lack of oxygen, also if a baby's born prematurely, can cause brain damage. And post-birth, postnatal, is abuse, neglect, malnutrition, especially when children are young, injury, lack of cognitive stimulation can all also lead to intellectual disabilities. So very much there's a large etiology for intellectual disabilities, both genetic and environmental, and interaction between the two happening while the child is in the womb, during birth, and also in the first few years of a child's life that can impact significantly on their intellectual functioning. And the final slide is the giftedness component. So it's that score at the 2% of the right-hand side of our bell curve about a child being gifted. So above sort of 120 to 129 on an IQ test would be considered superior, and 130 plus is very superior. So schools rely solely on heavily on intelligence testing, but we also do need to look at other qualities when we look at gifted children. Often it's a very innate and raw talent to be gifted, but at the same time, if somebody is gifted, that gifted ability is improved through hours of practice, mentoring, and training. So somebody can be born with an exceptional skill, but it's only through honing that exceptional skill through hours of practice and mentoring training that you become exceptional, an exceptional talent. And when people are gifted and people are exceptional, they're often more likely to be committed to develop their skills because of the positive outcomes that they get from hard work. So that's what giftedness is that giftedness can be developed through extreme hours of practice, mentoring and training, and also a commitment to being gifted. And that gifted diagnosis only comes slightly in older children when we start to see skills coming out in the educational setting. You know, there's a number of skills, and if you Google giftedness, you'll see a number of signals that can actually say that a child is gifted. Might be able to repeat things with very little rehearsal, etc., etc. And there's gifted markers that people can look for. So that is it, guys. That's this module on intelligence. I hope you enjoyed it. It is very interesting. And yeah, I mean, if you've got any questions, you're welcome to ask. Pop me an email. Rewatch this, but as I said, it will feature in our exams, I'm quite sure. The areas defining what intelligence is, make sure you can do that. Understand the difference between fluid and crystallized intelligence, but generally just know what we've covered in this module, and you should be good. Any questions? Nope, everyone's silent. All right. Okay, thanks, Lou. I'm just going to stop